webinar is being recorded. It doesn't matter if they're short or tall. It doesn't matter if, they're black or white. And then I kind of just threw in, or if they're a boy or a girl. And my mom, who's a very smart woman, said, "So you're gay?" And, there's a couple things about that because, I'll come back to this. And then I was like, yeah. And, what she said to me is like, well, some kids have cancer, some kids are paralyzed. We as parents, our job is to love you, and we love you no matter what. And, the good thing, there's a couple things that happened in the interaction, and I'll focus on the good stuff, and then I'll share some things that I think could have happened a little bit better. So the good thing about that is my mom said, "We love you no matter what." That to me was a huge relief. I had seen friends of mine get kicked out by their families. I'd seen all kinds of turmoil by friends and family once they found out that someone in their family was queer. And so just hearing my mom say, "We love you no matter what," it meant that I had a home. It meant that I got to keep my Madonna CDs. I got to keep my boombox. I got to keep my bed. So that was such a relief. And so I'm so, so grateful for that. I have thought a lot about this initial encounter, and I don't think it's fair for me to completely evaluate my mom on something that I kind of just surprised her with. But I will say, for the purposes of this conversation, some things that could have happened differently. One of the things that I think is difficult is my mom compared being queer to being paralyzed or having cancer, which, those are hard experiences in and of themselves. But there's sort of this implication that being queer is an illness or it's a disease that she needs to love me through. So that felt, in reflection, felt difficult, so to speak. So that's one thing to maybe think about. When your child comes out to you, you might be the first person on the planet that they are saying, "I'm gay to," or "I'm queer to." And your reaction can forever impact how they move, forward in the world on that journey, which again sounds like a lot of pressure. But, I think it's so important that those moments are treated with care and tenderness. And again, love. That's the thing that my mom did right. The other thing that's interesting about what my mom did is, and again, this, we'll talk a little bit about like the challenges of culture, but I will say that when I was first coming out, I definitely, and I still identify as bisexual. And so even though I use this sort of like weird way of doing it, or a tongue-in-cheek way of being like, and love is for boys and girls, that was also a way of me trying to assert a bisexual identity. And what my mom did was like, "Oh, so you're gay?" And again, this is where, the difference in culture around language is challenging. And in that moment, it was easier to say yes than to be like, "No, I'm bisexual," because I wasn't sure that my mom would understand that. But I think this is another example of how it's really important that when your child comes out, that you think about listening to what they're saying to you, right? Because they might not be using language that they might be telling you things that you're making assumptions about. So again, just because your child says to you they're trans doesn't mean they're gay. Those things are two different things. You can be trans and straight. You can be trans and bisexual. You can be trans and queer. So, again, I appreciate that some of this is new for a lot of parents. It certainly was new for my mom, and I don't hold it against her. But for the purposes of this conversation, I thought it might be useful to share some of the things that I think, even though my mom, I would still give her a solid 8 out of 10. I think a couple of things she could have done differently in that moment. The other thing that my mom has done really, really beautifully, and has been so awesome to watch, is her trajectory in terms of educating herself. So, we had that initial conversation, but then, I would send her articles, or she would ask me what kinds of books I'm reading. And without my knowledge, I once told her that my favorite book was Stone Butch Blues, and how this book had made a huge difference on my life. And without my knowledge, she went to the library and took it out and read it, and it's not an easy book. So I was very moved by that. And so I think one of the things that you can do as a parent, especially if you don't know the language, is you can start educating yourself. You can start learning. We live in an incredible time where there's so much information now, certainly a lot more information than there was before. And so much is changing rapidly. Like, I can't even stay on top of the terms that are being used in our community. So, do what you can to educate yourself. And it doesn't have to mean like reading a book. It could mean seeing movies. You can read articles. There's just so much information. And, one of my favorite examples of this is my mom, I went to visit her years later after coming out, and she'd cut out an article from about like pride in New Delhi, India. And she was like, look, our pride in India is better than your pride. And I remember thinking it was hilarious because she'd never been to a Canadian Pride before. So, I mean, how would she know? But I felt like that was her way of saying, look, I'm listening to you. I'm paying attention to you. I'm doing some research and stuff. Okay, I see maybe some questions starting to be put in. And I'm thinking, if it's okay with all of you, I'd love to just sort of like finish this presentation and then go through the Q&A, if that's okay. So I'm just gonna see if I can move this out of the way. Okay, so yeah, educate yourself. And then the other thing you can do, and again, this is a tricky one and different people feel different ways, so try not to take my word for it too much, but you know, I think one of the hard things about being marginalized, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this in your own experiences of being marginalized, is so often we have to become a spokesperson for learning. And so people ask us questions. And so this is why I started the conversation by saying, educate yourself first. But there might be instances where it's worth having a conversation with your child directly. And sorry, I'm going to have a sip of water here because babbling on. I'll never forget at some point, you know, again, I'd say about like 7 years after I'd come out, I think my mom probably heard me use the word queer a bit more. And so she just called me out of the blue and she's like, can you explain to me the difference between gay and queer? And I remember at the time being like, oh, mom, like, but now looking back, I actually like, I really respect it. You know, I would rather have parents who are interested, who are engaged, who are curious, than parents who are like, I don't want to know, I don't want to see, you know, that sort of thing that can sometimes happen. I have friends who they've come out to their parents and then it never comes up with their parents ever again. Their parents don't ask about them or their lives or their potential romantic partners or anything like that. So for me, this is an example when I look at it, even though in the time it felt like a challenging conversation, I'm just so grateful that my mom has stayed engaged by asking questions like this. So that's another thing that I really, really recommend is, you know, if you feel like you've educated yourself and you still have questions, there might be space, if your child is open to it, to have more conversation with them directly. And then one of the last things I want to leave you with before I jump into Q&A with you is I think when I look at the trajectory of my parents, what I see since I came out as, I guess, bi, or tried to come out as bi when I was 21, and then have subsequently, you know, come out as trans at 35. I've come out to my parents multiple times at this point. My parents haven't always gotten it right. You know, in fact, a lot of the times they've gotten it wrong. You know, mostly recently with being trans. My parents still don't use my pronouns, you know, and it's hard because I think in Western culture, there's such a pressure for your parents to like do everything right, which I think sometimes feels like, I'm sure, a lot of pressure on you to get everything right. But I think for me, what has allowed me to reimagine acceptance and to stretch what I think is maybe possible around acceptance is to witness my parents trying and to really, really, so like my parents making gestures, even if they haven't been 100% right, for me means more to me than them using my pronouns all the time. You know, like, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, my parents come from a culture where the language of queer or bisexual or trans aren't necessarily words that are used all the time. And so it's been hard to like not use those kinds of terms. But what's really exciting is that, like, you know, when I'm in Little India with my parents, my mom makes sure I get the best discount on bangles. Or when they go to India, you know, my mom buys me bangles. Last time she went to India, she bought me bindis. And last time we went to India, she went to India, she brought me this beautiful like flower crown and she gave it to me. Most recently, she emailed me and she's like, I'd love to, and this is very, very new. This is very, very, very fresh. but she, still struggling with the pronouns. But in the email, she's like, I'm wondering if you want any of my wedding saris, would love to give this to my daughter. And it's the first time that she's used that. And so for me, I think seeing my parents try, and here, this quote, very beautiful. If I send a selfie to my parents, from a gig or something, my dad will be like, you look so beautiful, which is so nice to hear. And so again, seeing that my parents try and that they do see me in their own way allows me then to receive their trying as acceptance. And like I said, it's allowed me to reimagine what acceptance looks like. Maybe in my family, my parents will never use my pronouns. But if my dad keeps telling me I'm beautiful and my mom keeps giving me discounts on Indian jewelry, and if they keep learning and educating and loving me and showing up and wanting to come to my art like projects and, engage, asking me questions about my life and being curious, and like I said, loving me no matter what, that to me feels more important than anything else. So, this isn't a pass for you not to use pronouns and whatnot, but I think I want to offer this because I want you to know that I think sometimes it's also about giving your children the benefit of the doubt as well. And the way that queer children are expected to give our parents the benefit of the doubt, I think you also need to give us the benefit of the doubt that, if you try, hopefully we're able to receive that as well. So I wanted to, and there's me. You can go, if you want. But I wanted to show that too, just so you get a sense of like the 12-year-old that we were talking about. So yeah, those are, like I said, I spent a lot of time thinking about what kinds of things my parents did and have been doing for me on this long journey of queerness from adolescence to adulthood. Because most of you are going to be stuck with your children for forever. So I wanted to share a range of experiences and anecdotes, and then now I'm really happy to take any questions that you might have. So I'll just look here in the chat. I've stopped the presentation. So okay, so. Hi, Vivek. Thanks for your informative session and sharing your experience and tips. Can gender identification start at a very young age, toddler less than 4 to 5 years of age? This is a really this is a really complicated question. I would say that for me as a child, I was certainly drawn and exhibiting what we would call in North America feminine attributes and interests since childhood, I would say. That doesn't necessarily mean that I knew what my gender was. Again, I was 2, 3, 4, 5. But I think that if you have a child who says they know who they are, I think the most important thing is that we listen to them. And I think this is where things get controversial, because there's this idea, well, what if they change their mind? How do you know? You're so young, you have your whole life ahead of you, blah, blah, blah. And the thing is, non-trans people change their minds all the time. I think about my brother and the choices that he's made in his life, about his appearance, about his interests. He's changed his mind a lot. But trans people or gender non-conforming people, as soon as we exhibit any kind of curiosity or confusion, it's seen as a bad thing. And so for me, I think it's more important to celebrate the individual's journey. And of course, as a parent, there's probably going to be some protective mechanisms in place where you feel protective about, your child's journey. But I think that children are so much more self-aware, so much more autonomous than we give them credit for. I look at my journey and, again, to use the idea of bisexuality, I feel like I knew I was bisexual, in my teens. And then I had to work really, really hard in my 20s and 30s to reclaim it, because everyone was like, no, you're confused, blah, blah, blah. And similarly with transness, I often feel what would have transness looked like if I had known about it? Like, would I have maybe accessed transness sooner if I had access to it when I was younger, as opposed to coming out as trans when I was 35? So do children have the capacity to exhibit gender, like to identify differently with their gender at a young age? I think absolutely. And I think, you know, it's so important to not see that as confusion, but to like support them along their way. And you might have someone who during their infancy exhibits interest in feminine attributes or behaviors or objects that might, quote unquote, you know, change that interests or change those behaviors in their teenage years. And again, I think your job as a parent is to support them on that journey, as opposed to being like, you know, I think, you know, again, to talk about my mom, one of the best things my mom did for me was she never said, this is for boys and this is for girls. I never, ever heard that in my house. So like when I was interested in my mom's jackets, when I was interested in her clothes, she was never like, this is for women. No, she would lend it to me. And I think that's such a beautiful, beautiful thing, because that no would have caused more pain, would have caused more hurt. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Thanks. There's a nice little compliment here from Maria. Really appreciate it. Okay, my child loves to wear gender nonconforming clothes, which I welcome, but then at school he's ridiculed. I want to support him, but now he's scared to wear them outside of the house. We've talked about how people are scared of what they don't understand, and they might not understand that a boy can wear a dress and that everyone is allowed to wear what they want. And make them comfortable. How do I better support my child? Thank you so much for this question, Crystal. It sounds like you're doing an amazing job supporting your child, which is so lovely. And that's so real, like exactly what I was just talking about. I was very fortunate to get to live in a house where I got to wear my mom's jacket, but the moment I left the house, I was teased. And so, you know, I think part of it, I'm trying to think, like, what should my parents have done? But I think part of it in some ways is the work that you're already doing, right? That, you know, people are scared of what they don't understand. And so some of it might be about confidence boosting. And like, I hate that queer and trans people our job is to be more confident in a homophobic and transphobic world. It shouldn't be on us. But I do think the opposite is your child then feeling like they have to hide who they are. And when I think about that being my journey as someone who did hide who I was eventually in school, that to me was deeply painful. So if there's anything that can be done to build your child's confidence around wearing the clothes they like to wear, that would be lovely. And so some of the things that are crossing my mind in terms of how to build your child's confidence, so it's not just on them, is like, is there a way to get support from the teachers in the school around this? Is there a way to get support from the school at large around this? Is there a GSA? Again, there's going to be no teacher or principal that can be around for all the moments that your child is in a dress potentially in school. But if the teacher is made aware that your child is being harassed in school or made fun of, then maybe they can pay more close attention to making sure that that doesn't happen. So that would be one, those would be some things that I would do. The other thing is to try to see, for me, confidence as a queer person is an ongoing journey, but what has helped me build my confidence has been meeting other queer and trans people, meeting other gender nonconforming people. So I know it sounds like your child is very young, but is there external services in your community, in your service, where your child can then, maybe they don't feel comfortable wearing a dress at school, but are there programs for youth or children in your neighborhood, in your area, in your city that you can access, where your child can then wear what they want to as a building block around other queer and trans people to build that confidence. So again, when I say, you know, is there a way to boost their confidence? It's not about just being like, hey, we need to work on your confidence. It's like, how do you use the resources in your school, in your community, to show your child that who they are is a beautiful thing, and that maybe the people around your child can step up a little bit to support them. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Do you have concerns about the number of young people who are coming out as trans? No, actually, I think that this is my take. I think that there has always been gender nonconformity. I think gender nonconformity, transness has always existed, but I think what has existed more actually is that we've lived dominantly in a culture that has worked really hard to repress it. And we've also lived in a culture where we haven't seen it represented. And now that I think we've seen some shifts in the culture, certainly in representation, having trans people on the cover of Time magazine, having trans people on TV that are not just on Jerry Springer. I think the increase in representation, and also I think our culture wanting to do better. I mean, even something like this that we're doing today, like I cannot have even imagined this happening, 20, 25, 30 years ago in Alberta, and having someone like me come in and talk. So I think it's actually what it is it's not that there are more trans people that are coming out. I think that there's a bit of a shift in culture that allows more people to be who they are in the world, or who they want to be, as opposed to being repressed. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. And again, I will probably say this a million times tonight, but I think that queer and trans people are under so much pressure to be certain all the time. We're not allowed to experiment. We're not allowed to explore. We're not allowed to be confused. But I actually think confusion is a gift that we should everyone, cis people, straight people, are confused all the time. I can't tell you how indecisive my straight and non-trans friends are. And just similarly, I feel like trans people should have the right to change our minds, to explore, to experiment. I think that these are all rich, beautiful things that make life what it is. And I think our job is to support people in those ways. So yeah. Okay. Who is a queer? Interesting question. So, I mean, the way that I use queer as an umbrella term. Sorry, I'm not watching the chat right now. I hope that's okay. I'm really watching the Q&A. So I see that Margaret is doing a wonderful job of getting people to do that as well. I hope that's okay. So, when I think of the word gay or lesbian, gay is typically, it generally means a male who's sexually attracted to a male. A lesbian is a woman who's attracted to a woman. I usually use queer as a more umbrella term. Sometimes gay is also used as an umbrella term, but I often use queer as an umbrella term for people who are, attracted to a range of sexual possibilities. And the reason why I like queer is because there's a negative history that's rooted in queerness, in the word queer. And so often when words have been used as a way to hurt people, there is a reclamation that those people sometimes take on by embracing those words. So a similar word is bitch, right? In the 90s, there was a lot of women who started reclaiming the word bitch because it's such a negative word. And so, we have Meredith Brooks, which hopefully some of you are old enough to remember that song, I'm a Bitch. But similarly in the queer community, it is a word that a lot of us have tried to reclaim. There's some people in the older generations who still don't like hearing the word because they've heard it so much as an insult. So, you have to be careful about how you use it. I often feel like allies can use the word queer, but it's about how you use it. So if you say, I want to be a queer ally, I want to learn more about the queer community, how do I support queer artists? These are all wonderful ways of using queer. You don't want to run up to someone and call them a queer, obviously. And yeah, like I see the word queer getting used a lot in academia. I see it used a lot, when referring to like events and things like that. So yeah, that's a quick overview of queer. Do you know what the laws are around pronoun use in Ontario and Canada? Do you know what the policy around it is in TDSB? I think that I'm going to have someone from the TDSB maybe answer this question because I actually do not know. I don't actually know about laws around pronoun use in Ontario and Canada either. I'm sorry about that. But hopefully there's somebody else in this room that maybe know this information.
As for the Toronto District School Board, we've dropped the link in the chat to our policy, so please take a look at it.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Okay, there's a wonderful comment from Jessica. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, some religions require to shun any gay or transgender people. What would you advise to those who know will lose everyone and everything if they admit who they are? I mean, one thing I would say is this language of everything and everyone, I think is a bit strong. I think for someone who's from a really religious community and they're struggling with whether or not to come out within their religious community, again, going back to this idea of bolstering confidence, I think what I would recommend is is there a way to find community outside of their direct religious community first as a way to build chosen family. So, you know, whether that's, and what's amazing is that there's so many online groups and sometimes in-person groups that are intersectional. So queer Muslim groups, queer, you know, Jewish groups. And so I would, if I was that individual, I would be like, try to find other people who share your belief system online. So you have a place that you can talk to, so that if you do, quote unquote, lose people in your biological family or people in your religious community, you know, you have other people you can lean on. So that would be how I'd answer that. How do you find my confidence and establish your strong sense of self despite the bullying? What advice would you give trans kids who are struggling? Well, first of all, I mean, it's interesting to talk about confidence again. I would say that with confidence, part of it for me has been admitting to myself that it's a work in progress. I don't wake up, there's not a single day I wake up in the morning where I'm like, I love being trans, you know, like there are days where being trans is really hard. And there's some days that being queer is really hard. And I think so much of it really comes down to community. And when I say community, I don't mean 50 people. That's not been my experience of community, but having people who love you in your life, who see you for who you are, who love you, who you can go on WhatsApp and be like, you know, I just crossed the street and someone called me tranny, and then they can show up for you in whatever way. Send you a box of donuts via Uber Eats or something. I don't know. So, you know, I really think that for me, it's like my biggest advice I would give to someone who's trans, who's first coming out, is to say, first of all, welcome. So happy that you're here. Second, I would say, you know, yeah, bolster yourself, armor yourself, create armor with people around you who will love you and show up for you. And then I might also even say, realistically, as someone who's been trans now, out as trans for 5 years, it doesn't # get better. Like it's hard. It's every day is a different experience. But I think the more that I am trans in the world, the more well, maybe I shouldn't say it doesn't get better, but the more I know how to navigate it, the more when I get harassed, it's not that it doesn't hurt, it's I know how to deal with it better. And so, you know, I think it's really about like not making any promises per se, but also just sort of like, you know, being clear that like it is a long and hard road, but like there's also so much beauty and so much richness that comes from being trans and queerness that I'm so happy to have access. And so, yeah, I don't know. Those would be some of the things that I would say. Do teenagers flip-flop as they develop and grow up? I mean, I've talked about this a little bit. Sure, yeah, I think that that's definitely possible. I think the language of flip-flop is really dismissive. So I'd be cautious about using that language as a parent, because it suggests that the choices that a child is making aren't valid, that they're wishy-washy. And I think it's so important that we honor a child where they are on their journey. And so if a child is displaying interest in a particular kind of behavior or particular kinds of, you know, objects or materials or media, I think it's about encouraging them as opposed to being like, you know, maybe they'll flip flop. That's not to say that a child who might seem gender nonconforming might not change their mind down the road. But again, I think we should have the right to change our mind. I think the biggest gift we can give queer and trans people is the right to be confused, the right to change our minds. But I worry about so Vivek, I love and respect what you're saying about the exploring changing your minds, but I worry about the effects of surgery and hormones can be irreversible. Okay. Fair enough. But again, like, I don't know, trans people, there are trans people who detransition. There are trans people who go off hormones. You know, surgery is a choice that is made. But again, like, I don't know, I would rather we live in a culture. I think when we tell children and teenagers that they're not old enough to make a decision about their bodies, we are undermining, again, their sense of who they are in the world. So I think it's, you know, I think as a parent, your job is, and I'm sorry, I'm saying your job, but you're a lot, and I respectfully, I'm not a parent. So I know that the work you're doing is so much harder than I can possibly imagine. But I think parents, it's more about providing the information, you know, like I think sometimes the conversation, the way it plays out is like, well, you might be making the biggest mistake of your life, you know? And I think it's like I think you provide the information with your child. You know, it's like, if you get surgery, this is what it means. And I think maybe some of the information is like actually finding out, like, what would it mean for your child to change their mind? What kind of surgeries would be involved if your child wanted to change their mind? Are they irreversible? Are all of them irreversible? And like, you know, how does your child feel about that? You know, and again, I think at some point we have to find ways to treat our children culturally, and teenagers with a little bit more respect than we sometimes do. So again, I don't think it's cut and dry. I think these conversations are difficult. I don't think that there's a right or wrong way, but I think mostly it's about, I think the wrong way is being dismissive. I think it's the wrong way is using language like flip-flop. I think the wrong way is, you know, suggesting that somebody's making the worst decision of their lives. Like, again, when I say support them on their journey, it really is about like, how do you provide them with as much information as possible? Hopefully that answers your question. Do you have any advice for parents who might want to come out to their kids, for instance, realizing oneself as queer, still in love with their other parent, no plans to leave, but wanting their child to know that their parent as their true self too? Oh, that is so beautiful. I love this question. I mean, it really depends on the context. I think that, you know, I don't know what the situation is with this person and their partner. Like, obviously, if their partner doesn't know, it makes it a little bit more difficult to share with one individual, because then if you are just telling your child and not your partner, you're then essentially burdening your child with a secret. I would not recommend that, as much as I think it's a beautiful gesture. I've been in positions where a family member has been burdened with a secret, even if it doesn't feel like a burden, it does. So I would say, if you want to discuss your queerness with your child, I think that the first thing is making sure that your spouse, if you have one, your partner, if they have one, is someone that you feel comfortable sharing that with first, and then sharing it with your child. I mean, I think, you know, it really depends on your child and like what you think they might be capable of. But I think, you know, a simple conversation about who you are, you know, like you could even use something similar to what I did with my mom, right? That like, for you feel like love is something, you know, if you identify as queer, let's say, or bi, maybe it's around like how you feel like love has no boundaries, and how you want to encourage them as well to see love beyond just being attracted to the same sex, and say, like, you know, you yourself are someone who has had attractions that are not limited to the opposite sex. So that might be one approach to take. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. But I would first make sure that it's clear with your partner, and then it also might be multiple conversations with your child, you know, depending on where they're at. It could also come out like kind of innocuously, you know, if you end up watching something where there's like a gay character or something like that, and you end up talking about the movie, it could come up in conversation sort of innocuously, as opposed to you feeling like you need to sit down and make a declaration of sorts. So yeah, I think that's really beautiful, and I wish you all the best with that. I just want to be conscious of time. There's a lot of questions here, and I can't remember how much time we have. So I just want to check in if someone could just let me know how I'm doing time-wise.
We have until 8 o'clock.
Perfect, great. My child presents as his assigned sex at birth, but he tells us that he feels neither like a boy or a girl, and is non-binary. I hope this is also going okay. I hope this is all very useful to you. I'm really trying my best to dig into all your questions. So non-binary, he would like to still use he, him pronouns, but till let us know if he would like to use they, them. I don't know to support him, because practically there is nothing to do. How do we make sure he feels comfortable if he starts to feel differently about how he would like to present in terms of his gender? Okay, so he would like to still use he, him pronouns, even though he feels he's non-binary and doesn't identify as boy or girl, but will let us know if he would like us to use they, them. I mean, this is such a great question, and I love it. And I think really it's just about taking your child's lead. I think the fact that they're telling you, hey, listen, I don't identify as a boy, I don't identify as a girl, but for now I want to use he, him pronouns, wonderful. Like, follow their lead, follow his lead. If that's what he wants, that's lovely. And there's a lot of non-binary people who use a range of pronouns. pronouns, right? Like I know some non-binary people who use he and them or she and they, right? So I think this is wonderful. And in terms of supporting them, I think the fact that your child has opened up to you in this way is such a beautiful, beautiful thing, because that means they already trust you. I think one of the things you can do is check in with them every so often. You don't have to do it every month, but I think you could, every few months, you could be like, hey, remember that question we had? That conversation we had about your gender and being non-binary. We just want to check in with you to see, how you're feeling around your pronouns. If there's anything else we could be doing to support you, like check in with your child regularly. And it sounds like you have the kind of child who would give you that information. So, I mean, to answer your question, I don't think there's anything more you have to do than you're already doing. Just continue to be loving and supportive and checking in with your child, and let them take the lead. Let him take the lead, so to speak. My 5-year-old kiddo identifies as male and recently asked to change pronouns at school. I share custody and my kiddo has asked not to tell their dad. How does the school manage this in terms of transition? This is a really great someone's mic might be on right now. But I think the conversation I think the conversation maybe starts with the confidential conversation with your school, and to see what their policy is. I do hear instances of students who use certain pronouns in school and then don't use them at home, and that their parents actually don't know. And so again, it really depends on the policy in school, but I do think that the conversation would start in the school just to see what's possible and what they're open to. I do think it's not impossible from what I've heard. I mean, certainly when I was a college teacher or a university teacher, like the conversation, the way that I address my students in class would be very different than if a parent reached out to me. So I would assume that the same thing would apply. And it looks like someone else is maybe going to answer that question as well. So, okay, I embrace people's gender nonconformity. We need to make life safer for feminine males. Are you concerned at all about the lack of long-term data on the medical pathways that young people are encouraged to access? For example, Lupron, breast binding. Do you feel it's possible to make space for all sorts of gender nonconformity without having to believe that people literally can change sex, that medicalization was required, that there are other sex categories than M or F, for example, non-binary? I absolutely agree that we need to make life safer for feminine males. I have often wondered, would if I grew up in a world where being a quote unquote feminine male was okay, could I have been, and by okay, like what I mean is like, did I need to access a trans identity to be feminine in the world? So this is a question that like I really, really resonate with. I think you're right. Like and this is where I think representation also like needs to be better, is like, how do we provide more information? And again, I think going back to the parents who are like, what about the surgery being irreversible? I think if you can provide your child with a lot of options around thinking about their gender and presenting their gender without it seeming coercive, because I think the last thing you want to do is be like, have you thought about displaying your gender as a feminine person, but without surgery? And if it seems like you're trying to change their mind, I don't think that's going to work very well. But I think a conversation that talks about the ways in which transness, there's so many ways to be trans in the world. There's so many ways to be non-binary in the world. And more people are making very different choices. I am someone, for instance, who has not accessed hormones, who has not accessed surgery, and definitely identifies trans. And so I really like your question a lot. And I do think that, yeah, I think we need to do a better job. And that's one of the reasons, to be honest, why for me as a person with a public platform, I do talk about this, because sometimes I feel guilty about not being trans enough because I haven't done surgery, because I haven't taken hormones. And then I remind myself that actually what the world needs is many different types of transness, so that there are different examples that can be pointed to, so that people who don't necessarily want to get surgery or aren't sure about surgery or hormones, they know that there are other options in place in terms of how they want to present their gender or be their gender in the world. So definitely agree with you, and definitely think that that is a useful thing to talk about with your children if there are conversations about surgery happening. Are kids still bullied in the way you were at school? What can the school community do about it? I mean, I think you can probably answer, or the TDSB can probably answer this better than me. I think from what I encounter when I do talks like this and when I meet with young people, I definitely see tremendous change. Things like gay straight alliances in high schools and junior highs did not absolutely exist at all. Even the language of homophobia didn't exist around me. So these things feel like really awesome that they exist, but often it feels like very privileged places like art schools or schools in bigger cities that have these things. So I do think when I have these conversations and talks, it really seems like people in smaller cities, students in smaller cities still encounter the same kinds of bullying that I encountered. In terms of what we can do better, I mean, again, I think like, if your child is in one of these schools, it is about looking into what kinds of resources are there. And if there are none, if you can look beyond the school, within your community to see if you can support your child in that way. If there's nothing in your community, can you look to the internet? Can you bring materials into your house, whether that's like queer films or books, as a way to create a sense of safety for your child and like that sort of like armor that I've talked about a couple times. And if you're in an institution, if you work in an institution that can be doing better, you can also create resources. I think, I'm someone who, when I've seen a gap in something, I'm like, well, how do I create something? So if you're seeing a gap around you, it might be you that needs to make that change. We might be all waiting for you to do that. So I think those would be a couple things that I would recommend. What are your thoughts on the research that illustrates a connection between autism and kids who demonstrate gender diversity dysphoria? I unfortunately am going to have to pass on this question. This is not research I'm familiar with, so it's not a question that I feel equipped to answer. This question does make me a little bit nervous. This kind of research, anytime queerness or transness is medicalized, I often feel very uncomfortable because I think that often the conversation around medicalization or, the gay gene, so to speak, it's so closely linked to eradication. If there's a gay gene, it's the next follow-up question is often, not from you, but generally the next question in the air is, how do we get rid of it? So, I'm someone, and I also as someone, I feel very strongly about the ways in which I feel like my gender and sexuality have been both nature and nurture. I don't believe I was quote unquote born this way. I do think that there was a lot of my social environment that impacted who I am. And so lots of complicated feelings around science, supposed scientific data when it's linked to queer and trans people. So sorry, can't answer that question. If it's not too personal, I appreciate a tiny peek into your first crush-turned relationship. I'm so excited for my daughter to experience her first crushes and the love. Also, skincare routine. Okay, well, let's start with the skincare because I'm ready to answer this question. Clinique. They haven't paid me for a brand deal or anything, so I could just be transparent with you, but I've been moisturizing for a good 20 years and doing the 3-step. Hopefully some of you are old enough to know the 3-step system that Clinique has. And so I've been doing the 3-step pretty ritualistically for a good 20 years. So I think it's working, hopefully, and sunscreen. And then first crush, I love your excitement for your daughter. That's really, really nice. I'm so happy that they have you. I mean, to be honest, it was really, really challenging, because I think, again, I learned very soon that my desires were wrong. And so I had to kind of compartmentalize my desires. And so there was a lot of shame around being queer, about being attracted to men. And then also within the queer community, there was a lot of stigma around bisexuality. And so I had a lot of shame around my attraction to women. I will say that, though, I don't want to just depress you. So I will say that I'm 40 and I'm madly in love. I've been with my partner. This year is our 10-year anniversary. I still feel like we're in the honeymoon phase. Every time he walks through the door, my heart still flutters. So, and one of the reasons why I feel so joyful in our relationship is I could have never imagined accessing something like this when I was younger. I feel so lucky, so privileged to be in the province that I grew up in Alberta and get to be in a queer relationship. So, regardless of what your daughter's journey is, I hope that she gets to experience love at some point in her life. It might not be right away. It might not be those early crushes. But down the road, I really hope that love is there. Okay, more questions here. Let's see. I've received pushback around imbalance between the number of boys and girls in classes, told I shouldn't ask because we don't actually know how many girls and boys were truly in the class because we couldn't know their gender identity. Also in one class, 2/3 are girls in the class of 20 ID as non-binary. So the person I was speaking to said I shouldn't matter at all. And why should I even ask? I felt my concerns about sexism were being disregarded. How do we address sexism if we can't observe sex? Yes, this is an important question. I think that part of it is, yes, sorry, I'm trying to put my thoughts here together. I think that sexism is very real. I don't think that we should undermine sexism. I do think there's ways in which stats around boys versus girls can be pointless. So, for instance, when I'm booking a flight, I always find it bananas. There's so many things where you're forced to check off a box, men or female. And I think some of those are getting better. There's trans or whatever. But overall, I'm like, why do we need to know the individual's gender? So I'll start there. So sometimes the information is not necessary, but I do think you're right. Like when discussing oppression, it's important to note difference, right? So one of the things that I struggle a lot with is people like, why do we need to talk about race? So we're all human. And I'm like, well, if we don't talk about race, we can't talk about racism. So I really appreciate where your question is coming from. I'm going to give you an answer that I haven't, I haven't really thought this through. So please bear with me. But my thinking around it, especially when I think of like the work that's being done around International Women's Day, is how do we include trans people? How do we include non-binary people in those conversations? Because the idea around sexism is that you have, my understanding of sexism is that you have people who are in a position of power, i.e. men, who then oppress people, a gender who don't have that power, i.e. women, but trans people and non-binary people also don't have that power. So when we talk about sexism, how do we include non-binary people? How do we include trans people in that conversation? So it's not to say that women do not experience sexism, but I think it's about thinking about how do non-binary people and trans people also experience, if we don't call it sexism, but some form of gender discrimination. So part of it might also just be, how do we change the language so we're not talking about sexism, but gender discrimination? But yeah, I don't think we can or should move away from the conversation around sexism, but I think it's about just reimagining it so that it includes other people who also experience gender discrimination. Do you have any suggestions in supporting a very shy trans teen to join a group or drop in? They feel very alone, but hesitant to join an activity to group to allow them the chance to meet other trans teens. Okay, this is such a great question. And I feel like I resonate, so many times today I've been like, find a community for your child, blah, blah, blah. But to be honest, I was that kid who would not have gone to a gay group. I used to see signs at my university, just did not feel comfortable. I think it's a couple things. I think it's about providing your child the information. I think for me, just knowing that my university, for instance, had queer programming, it just made me feel like, okay, even if I'm not at that group, it's good to know a group exists. I don't know, there's just something about knowing the groups exist that's useful. I think that, again, as I've mentioned so many times in this talk, people do change their minds. And so you never know what activity or what group might appeal to your child. So I think it's just about providing your child the information. I think, for me as someone who's really shy, what I have really liked is one-on-ones. And so, is there a way to find resources? Again, I don't know if you're in Toronto, but I worked for an organization. I did some volunteer organization for an organization called Supporting Our Youth, SOY. And they at the time had a big brother or big sister or big person, I should say, program, a mentor program where we would do one-on-one activities. So, a program like that, if it still exists, might be useful because that's an opportunity for your child who's maybe shy to spend a little bit of time with another trans person, who's older, but who goes through like a highly like, a rigorous selection process and all that. So that might be an option, is like trying to figure out like other one-on-one activities. Sometimes it might be just about like taking your child to queer things and being with them, but then they're in a queer space with you, sort of thing. So I'm thinking about like going to a queer movie together, because what that might do is they're still at a queer event, they're with you who they clearly feel comfortable with, but there probably will be other queer people there. And even if they don't want to talk to them, they're still in the same room together. Or taking them to like a queer book reading, if there's an author. I mean, we're starting to bring back some of these events, and maybe for now, maybe to explore some of these virtual events, right? Like if there's like a queer author and they're doing a virtual reading, maybe it's about like you and your child attending that together as a starting point so that they get comfortable going to these things. So hopefully some of that's useful to you. Can you talk about the experience of writing a book, The Boy and the Bindi? It's so important for educators to use resources like this in the classroom to create safer spaces and have discussions whether they are queer kids in their classroom or not. Yes, asking kids their pronouns on the first day of school and kindergarten up, ongoing discussions. Yes, love that. I mean, this is one of the reasons I wrote The Boy and the Bindi, to be honest. I just, I kept being told that children's books had changed. And then I was on a jury once and I saw that most of the children's books didn't feature queer children. They were mostly written by white authors or featured white kids. And I really wanted to make a change. So then going back to that question that we just talked about, I felt like one of the things I could maybe do to change what I was seeing in the world was to write a children's picture book that highlighted the beauty of gender nonconformity. So that's sort of how that book came about, and I was really lucky to have the support from a publisher, Arsenal Pulp Press. They're so wonderful, and they'd never done a children's book before, and they took a risk on it. Which again, I think it's something to remember if you're in a position of power. How do you use your power to help support community or artist initiatives? The other thing I will say about The Boy and the Bindi, if you're interested, there is a teaching guide that goes with it on my website. If you go under The Boy and the Bindi in the book, that's specifically for children, in terms of how to have some of these conversations in the classroom, because I know that it's not easy. So it allows you to use The Boy and the Bindi as a resource, but then structure like little activities with your classmates. And it was the children's book, the teaching guide was put together by teachers here in Calgary who work in an elementary school and stuff. So if that's useful to you, then yeah. I'm sorry. How can your child tell if they're transgender or struggling with their changes happening in their body through puberty or both? What do you suggest is the most supportive way to help them through this? I love them so much and want to help them as much as possible. How do your child know if they're transgender? Like I don't really subscribe to the wrong body idea. Like there's definitely, thank you so much for all these sweet events here. Sweet comments here. There are some trans people that very much are like, I feel like I'm in the wrong body, and that's valid. I don't subscribe to that. I don't think the issue is my body. I think the issue is we live in a world that is intent on labeling bodies one way or the other based on their genitalia. So I think it really depends on your child. Like if your child is saying that they think they might be trans, I think it's about like, how do you provide them resources so that they can materials. Here in Calgary, we have an organization specifically for trans youth called Skipping Stones. Again, supporting our youth might be a great resource, just so that your child has someone they can talk to. Like I think the hardest thing is not having someone to talk to. So as long as they have a place where they can talk to the things that they're feeling in their body or about their body or who they are, I think that would help them a lot. And obviously they're having that conversation with you, which is lovely. But I think it's about like finding people, like there are therapists who work specifically with trans people who are LGBTQ friendly, who are not about like medicalizing or pathologizing in sort of like the historical negative way. So that might be one thing. Again, it might also be seeing if you can introduce your child to other people in the community through community programming as a way to show your child the other opportunities that exist. I remember the first time I saw other brown queer people was during Toronto Pride. And, I was like 21 years old or 22 years old. And I was like, whoa, there's other queer brown people. So even sometimes just seeing other people through in person or through media or stories or whatever can sometimes help solidify or clarify who you are. So yeah, I think any of those things might be useful, or any of the other things we've talked about here tonight. From my kid, I'm a trans girl and you're awesome. Oh, that's so nice. I say hello to you and you're awesome as well. And I'm so glad you exist in the world. Have your parents been able to share their journey of raising you as a trans and their challenges, fears, and achievements, or what they overcome in? They haven't. And to be honest, I haven't really asked. And I don't know that I want to know, you know, like, I don't know. I guess part of it is like, I don't know how much I want to take on. I think what I appreciate is just, like I said before, how much they try. Like, that to me is the most meaningful thing. I also love when they talk about how they navigate it within their community. My mom told me that she was at a religious organization a few weeks ago and someone saw me on the internet or something and tried to gossip with her and be like, oh my God, I heard about your child. Are you okay? And like, she immediately shut down the conversation. And my dad was like, we don't care what like, they were on speakerphone because my parents are from India and they pretend like, I think they treat every call as a long distance call or something. But my dad was in the background. He's like, we don't care what anyone says about you. We love you. And I was just so moved. I was so moved. So again, it's like, I don't really know about their gender, sorry, not their gender, their journey, which again, I think they have each other to talk about maybe, or they can manage on their own. But I do love sometimes hearing anecdotes about how they navigate the questions they get in the world, because so often they reveal the pride they feel about me, which is really nice to hear. Okay, so we have and here we are. Hi, is this the Oscars? Is this my moment? It's like, dun, 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 dun. I'm just kidding.
That's about it, but I'll have you take the last question, please.
My daughter has another trans girl in her remote learning area who's come out online but not at home. How can I support this girl once the school year ends? I mean, again, I think, you know, is this a girl that comes to your house and spends time with your daughter? If so, like, is there a way to just show her that she's loved and cared about? You know, you don't want to betray your daughter's confidence. Like, if this girl has told your daughter in confidence, then you probably don't want to, you know, you don't want to make the assumption that she's okay with you knowing. But I think if your daughter spends time with her at your place, I think the biggest thing that I can just, like, I will hit on the head over and over again tonight is, do not underestimate the power of love. I think parents, so often they struggle. They're like, how do I be a good parent? What do I do? And the thing I say over and over again is that, like, the thing that my mom did for me as someone who came from India, didn't know the language, didn't know what homophobia was, didn't know what was going on in school, is that she loved me fiercely. I grew up in a house where I never heard this was for men or women. And I grew up in a house where she was constantly showing me that she loved me. So I think if you can show that to this other young girl somehow, I think that would be really helpful. And if you know, your daughter and her reveal to you that they're comfortable with you knowing this information, then maybe the work is you having the conversation with the parents, if this young girl feels comfortable with you doing that as an ally. So those would be some of the things that I'd recommend. And before I wrap up, I just want to thank all of you so much. I really, really sympathize. Like I said, I feel like I watch the things that my parents have been through and the ringer that I put them through as someone who's constantly evolved. And I'm so moved by the ways that they've come on this journey with me. And it sounds like so many of you are doing that as well. So, you know, lots of love to all of you. And thank you so much for giving me this space to give you a lot of unsolicited opinions, especially as a non-parent.
You're muted, Michelle.
Vivek, let me just read an incredible statement that I think will wrap up the sentiments of most of the audience this evening. Hi, Vivek. Thanks so much for this talk. And it was lovely to hear about your mom. I have a 3-year-old trans kid. As part of bolstering our capacity and confidence as a family to support our child, we have been inviting our extended family to attend workshops and talks. As a South Asian family, your experience is particularly important for us to hear about. Also, we love the boy in the bindi. Thanks for all that you do. I really think that wraps up how essential your dialogue has been tonight in your conversation with us. And thank you for saying, you know what, Michelle, don't let me talk too long. let me just say a few words. Let me just answer people questions because I find more value in that. And I really saw the value in that this evening. So thank you so much. You've given us so much to think, so much to ponder, and the tools and resources as you went along. And one of the things we try to do with the series is leave our audience with information and resource that they could go do a little more work, dig a little deeper, get some information. So we're so thankful that you said yes. We're so grateful that you joined us in TDSB, a part of our conversation series. And who knows? You may be back soon. Who knows?
Really, lots of
Who
love
knows?
to you. Thank you. And thanks
Thank
for
you so much.
TDSB. Lots of love to you.
And to our audience, thank you so much for joining this conversation, and we wish you a fabulous evening. Please make sure you use the resources that are there. We have resources for students, resources for adults and parents and caregivers. Please go and get them, take a look at them, dig a little deeper, and do the work to support your children. Have a great evening, everyone, and thank you for joining in.